Hello, it's Saturday, November 7th, 2020, and it is noonish, and I am Mark Edward Ochterman. You're receiving some image and hopefully some audio relating to that. And I'm continuing an examination of the use of process-oriented guided inquiry learning, their cycle of exploration, concept, invention, and application, with some modifications from my own interpretation of philosophy, art, craft, science, and looking specifically at an examination of some dialogues of Plato and the way that they could be used within roughly a pogil or pax framework. So one of the key elements of the Socratic method is the dialectic, and the dialectic is very clearly illustrated in the dialogue Euthyphro. The Euthyphro is essentially it's about as pure in terms of the methodical framework of the dialectic. It's about as pure as any statement of it in Plato. There's very little extra in the Euthyphro. There's a bit, but it's more of a kind of a prologue and an intro and an outro than it is really substantial within the dialogue. Intriguingly, the structure, not only the presence of the dialectic, but also the content of the dialectic is extraordinarily similar between the Euthyphro and the Meno, which from a standpoint of sort of literary criticism, one could come to the conclusion that one or the other of them probably was the model for the other, and then we could enter into debate as to which came first, the Euthyphro or the Meno. The Meno is distinct from the Euthyphro in that the so-called geometrical experiment with the slave boy, which sounds much more lurid than it really is a kind of a tangent. It's an illustration of one of the points. It extends the length of the Meno. The Meno has much more additional material outside of the immediate framework of the dialectic. The Euthyphro has just two characters, Socrates and Euthyphro. The Meno incorporates also Anytus. The Meno, both the Meno and the Euthyphro are tied to what you might say death days dialogues, like the Apology, the Crito, the Phaedo, but the Euthyphro is really quite loosely tied to that, and the Meno, although it's set more distant temporally from the trial of Socrates, nonetheless, it really seems to have a much stronger connection in terms of content to the trial and execution of Socrates. So these are some of the distinctions between these two, and a real question has to be raised if one is using pogil. To what degree would say any of this, sort of prefatory material which I've just presented in the context of a classroom? Because in a way, what you want is a kind of naive freshness of the students in terms of coming in and looking at this material. You almost want them to know nothing about it whatsoever. And then, get their, so to speak, unbiased viewpoint on it in the exploration stage. So then the question becomes whether it is better to have the students start with the Euthyphro, and I'm inclined to think that it is. The advantage of the Euthyphro, here are several advantages of the Euthyphro. It is shorter than the Menno. It does not have the complication of the additional character, of the digression about measurement of a square. It does not demand nearly as much historical contextualization for its full interpretation. The Euthyphro is pretty straightforward, even though the premise of it is a little puzzling to students. Maybe certainly it's puzzling to me as a student of the Euthyphro. But I think it's probably puzzling to others as well. But the Euthyphro is briefer, and it's more straightforward, and the dialectic in it, the framework, once you begin to recognize it, it's fairly evident, and it proceeds in a kind of a clear rhythm. Now, this dialectic, which is present in many Socratic dialogues, is often not as evenly paced as it is in the Euthyphro, and this makes the Euthyphro a very good starting point, because you can sense the rhythm of the dialectic in it. So, from a pogil standpoint, if what you're trying to do is to bring students to explore the dialogue on their own, I think the thing to do is to say, as you read this dialogue, be thinking about these kinds of problems. What is it that Euthyphro and Socrates are talking about? How do they go about looking at this problem? What pattern can you see, if any, in their conversation? And let me make that a little more detailed. Don't look at that in just a general sort of way, but look at that in a real specific way that and I hesitate to say too much more, because if I do, then, in a sense, I'm leading the audience. But let me just say that in terms of asking those kinds of questions, I mean, you could extend it to what are they talking about, how are they doing it, why are they doing it at all, consider why it is that they're doing it. guess you could, you know, bring all the question words in. Who is doing it? You know, so on. Some of those obviously are going to be easier to answer than others. So of course, you know, that's good, because then, you know, at least you can feel some success. Well, it's Euthyphro and Socrates, yay! But you know, just what are they doing and how are they doing it and why are they doing it? You know, these are much more difficult questions. You can also ask that, you know, where are they doing it, and that of course is going to lead to some other questions, because they're at the King Archon's court. Well, what the hell is that? You know, they're obviously in another world, in another time, and that to some degree has to be confronted. But I don't know how, you know, I guess another question that you could ask is, how significant is the temporality or the historical context? And the students may not be able to readily answer that question just by looking at the text. So then you can also say, well, you know, I mean, you all have your handhelds on you, you know, Google Euthyphro and see what you can find out, you know, is it really going to help you? And that becomes a very interesting part of the process of inquiry, you know. Sort of like Luke going into the cave in the second, well, whatever, 6th Star Wars movie, I mean episode 6, where he says, your weapons, you will not need them, you know, and it's kind of like, your handheld, you will not need it. It may be useful to be able to contextualize Euthyphro, but then again, it might be a misuse of 10-20 minutes, you know, scrolling down and looking through that. You know, I think it's gonna vary, you know, from one person to another as to how valuable that is. In doing that, you know, that kind of a search for study aids, or whatever you might want to describe them as being, might reveal some interesting terminology. So you'd almost certainly come up with things like the elenkos and the dialectic and so on. To what degree it's going to be useful to have that terminology before you have anything to, you know, to give that name to, is another question. Now, let me just say about my own background, particularly when I was first teaching in the early 90s, it really was my strong tendency to give a lot of information right from the get-go, you know, just to dump a lot of terminology and historical, you know, here's the Greeks were in a confederation fighting against the Persians, and then they were fighting with each other in Athens versus Sparta, and these kinds of things. And as fascinating as all of that is, and as entertaining as it was to me, and probably to, you know, 2 or 3 students, it certainly is outside of the range of a pogil approach to the Platonic dialogues. So, okay, so you raise these questions, you know, who's doing it, where are they doing it, why are they doing, what are they doing, how are they doing it? Now, I know from experience, and I have used this kind of method in classes, that very often the first responses that you get, you know, wow, you know, beyond just, well, it's Euthyphro and it's Socrates. Then the next thing that you get is that it's a kind of a play. It's like it's a play, because this is, you know, it's like a script. And there are two people speaking, and this one speaks and this one speaks, and it's also in the translation that I typically use, which is GMA Grooves. He does line it out, you know, in the way that if people have read plays, have read play scripts, say Shakespeare, they have seen this format, you know, where it says Euthyphro, Socrates, Euthyphro, Socrates. And that's useful. Okay, so they're having a conversation, and we're seeing, so to speak, the transcript of their conversation. What are they talking about? Well, they're talking about this, and then people have difficulty because the discussion is about piety. In English translation, it's about piety. And I have wondered whether there is another word that could be used to translate the Greek term, which is translated as piety. And I gotta say, I haven't really come up with anything better. So we're kind of stuck with that, and furthermore, we're stuck with it because you know, it's what we have. You know, it's what we have. So if someone comes up with a better rendering of Tahosion, you know, that's more current than the pious, then that's great. But you know, I think that's pretty much what we're stuck with, is the pious. That's what's being discussed here. But it's not really a term that is used very much. I'm trying to think, you know, when Donald Trump stands in front of the church across from the White House and holds up a Bible, people aren't discussing his piety, you know, whether he is pious or not. They might say whether he's truly religious or not, whether he's serious or not, you know, like what is he really up to. But that would have been an opportunity, or that is an opportunity, that kind of a situation is an opportunity to bring up this term. In all of the commentaries that I've seen of that act, I have not yet run across the term piety or pious. So it's a term that takes some explanation, and again, whip out the handheld, you know, run through, find, you know, hopefully not Urban Dictionary, but, you know, some relatively reputable dictionary. What is piety supposed to mean? And then you know, then we have that. It's something to work from. So we know who's doing it, we know what they're talking about, and okay, so then the next step is, and this is harder because you have to be looking at the whole, at the work as a whole. How do they work through this problem? And in my experience, this takes remarkably more coercion than I would have thought, and it's difficult for me because when I was in high school, I was introduced to the idea of the dialectic through a history instructor who introduced the term dialectic in looking at the material dialectic of Marx out of Hegel. And I felt very exalted as a 10th grader to be presented with Hegel, you know, and Marx, and to be trusted with such, you know, explosive mental material as this. And I knew that Plato had something to do with this, that you know, that the dialectic went back to Plato, but I found Plato very unappetizing when I tried reading his work. It may have been partly translations that I had, it may have been just that I thought that it was kind of dull material. So then that was all pretty dormant for me until I was a freshman in college, and I had an instructor for Introduction to Philosophy who I idolized, and so all of a sudden, because Plato was entertaining to him, Plato was entertaining to me, and but I can't remember exactly the process by which I came to identify the dialectic, and I have since looked for specific analyses of the placement of the structure of the dialectic in Euthyphro and in Meno, which I have abstracted and, you know, made up as a kind of a graph or chart. And I've never seen anyone else who has done it. So, you know, I should probably get a copyright on that and publish it. I haven't done it, which is stupid on my part, but oh well, you know. So unhappily, the only people who have had access to this, by and large, have been students of mine. I think I've handed these things out to a few other instructors, and I don't know really what they may have done with them. It probably should be more widely published, but be that as it may, I find that students often have a lot of difficulty finding the specific thread of the argument, and I'm not sure exactly why. I found it because I had already the mental template of the dialectic, of the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis. And so there is a question in looking at pogil, in exploration, the website, the pogil website anyway, says, exploration of a model through direct questioning. And if, in my experience, if you just turn students loose on the Euthyphro and say, find the structure of what they're doing, it's frustrating because, you know, it's 12 pages long or however long it is. At any rate, it's long enough that, and we're talking about words here, and they're not structured in a way such that there's an immediate obvious breakdown of the elements of the dialectic. They're there, they're quite evident, you know, once you know to identify them, you know, you say, oh, well, that was easy. But here's where the instructor has to step in to some degree. Well, I shouldn't say has to, but for efficiency's sake. You know, because if you were spending an entire semester looking at the Euthyphro, you know, you could take a couple weeks, you know, to flounder around and to say, no, wait a minute, let me, you know, because you only have, typically, you have 50 minutes, if you're, you know, doing everything really fast in terms of getting everybody settled and getting started on your process in terms of actual looking at something. You know, you might have maybe a half an hour. So you've got 3 half-hour inquiry sessions over the course of a week. Even if they're sneaking home and doing some extra work, which is maybe possible. Some of the students might do a little bit of extra work, but the likelihood is not great. So, you know, in an hour and a half, are you going to have this eureka moment? Oh, well, look, you know, he makes a statement, Socrates contradicts it, then he tries to respond, then Socrates finds a problem with that one as well, and then there's this, and then, you know, that the dialogue is not just talking back and forth and saying anything, but that there really is this kind of it's like 75% of a circle, you know, three quarters, and then you're kind of starting a new thing, so that it's always a little bit ahead. Or, you know, I'm not sure how exactly to describe the sort of emotional experience of the or rhythmic experience of the dialectic, but it always seems to be cranking things a little bit. You know, it's like a 5-4 meter where instead of having a neat conclusion, there's always a little torsion in it, or three, at any rate, you know, something odd against the 4, so that you've got this kind of a catch, you know, and then you start again. That, at any rate, has always been my, like I say, kind of impressionistic or emotional experience of the dialectic. So one way that you can bring students to be looking for more than just, oh, well, they're talking, oh, it's like a script. They're talking about piety, and they say this, then this, then this, then this, then this, then this. You know, that, I mean, that's a good start. You got to start with that, right? In the same way, you know, that by analogy, you go into a woods and you say, well, tell me what's going on here. What's happening in this wood? And, you know, the starting point is, well, there's this kind of plant and that kind of plant, and I saw a squirrel and I saw a woodpecker, and there's this and this and this and this, and all these things that are, you know, seem to be unrelated to each other. And then you start to look at the relationships between them. Well, the squirrel is doing this, and it's pooping, and its poop is doing this, and, you know, and you start to see the more complex relationships of an ecology. And not only do you see it, you know, in the moment, but then you can also view, here are how things are happening over time, because here's a place where a tree has fallen down, and this is creating this, you know, this opening where a different type of plant is coming in, and then you can talk about old field succession and those kinds of things. In the same way, looking at the Euthyphro, you know, the starting point is clearly, you know, this line, that line, that line, that line. Hello?